A single slap echoing through the hushed first-class cabin of a transatlantic flight. On one side, a veteran flight attendant, her face a mask of fury and indignation. On the other, a young black man in a simple hoodie, his cheeks stinging, his eyes filled with a calm that was far more terrifying than any anger. What happens when prejudice and power collide at 35,000 feet? Most people would assume the story ends with a complaint form and a quiet settlement. But this was no ordinary passenger. This was the son of a man who could buy the airline without checking his bank balance. And with one single phone call, he wasn't just going to get an apology, he was going to bring the entire plane and one woman's life crashing down to earth. The first-class cabin of Global Wings Air Flight 117 from New York's JFK to London Heathrow was an oasis of curated calm. The scent of warm towels, muted conversations, and the gentle clinking of champagne flutes created a bubble of tranquility against the organized chaos of a transatlantic departure. Passengers settled into their spacious pods, a collection of hedge fund managers, tech entrepreneurs, and a minor British aristocrat. Into this world walked Marcus Vance. At 22, he didn't fit the typical first-class mold. He wore a simple, unbranded charcoal hoodie, expensive but understated noise-canceling headphones around his neck, and worn-in sneakers. He carried a single leather backpack, not a rolling briefcase. He was unassuming, his youthful face marked by a quiet intelligence rather than overt arrogance. He found his seat, 2A, a window seat at the front of the cabin, and began to settle in, his movements economical and polite. His presence, however, did not go unnoticed. Karen Peterson, a senior flight attendant with 25 years of service, watched him from the galley. Her smile, which had been effortlessly warm for the silver-haired man in 3B, tightened almost imperceptibly. Karen prided herself on being a gatekeeper of this airborne sanctuary. She believed she could spot trouble, or at least someone who didn't belong, from a mile away. In her mind, the young man in the hoodie was an anomaly. An upgrade, perhaps? A contest winner? An employee's family member using a pass? Her mind cycled through the possibilities, each one diminishing his legitimacy in her eyes. "Can I get you a pre-departure beverage, sir?" she asked, her tone clipped, lacking the warmth she'd offered others. "Orange juice or water?" She deliberately omitted the champagne. Marcus looked up, pulling his headphones down. "I'd love a glass of champagne if you don't mind. Thank you." His voice was polite, a smooth baritone that held no trace of attitude. Karen's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she said, turning back to the galley. She returned and placed the glass on his tray with a little more force than necessary, a tiny clack of crystal on plastic. Marcus noticed but chose to ignore it. He'd grown up as the son of David Vance, the legendary founder of Vance Innovations, a tech behemoth that had revolutionized AI logistics. He was used to the subtle and sometimes not so subtle slights from people who made assumptions based on his age, his race, or his casual attire. His father had always taught him two things: never start a fight, but always be prepared to finish one. And second, grace is a weapon that your enemies rarely expect. As the plane taxied to the runway, Karen continued her service with a pointed neglect of seat 2A. She offered hot towels to everyone around him. She engaged the man in 2B in a lengthy, laughing conversation about his last trip to Ascot. Marcus simply read a book on his tablet. The trouble began an hour into the flight, somewhere over the Atlantic. The meal service was underway. Marcus had requested the seared halibut. When Karen delivered it, she practically dropped the plate in front of him. A piece of asparagus rolled off the dish and onto his lap. "Oh, goodness," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "You'll have to be more careful." The accusation hung in the air, thick and absurd. Marcus picked up the asparagus with a napkin. "No problem," he said, keeping his voice even. "Could I possibly get another fork? This one seems to have a bit of a bend in it." He held up the fork, which was indeed slightly misshapen. Karen snatched it from his hand. "I'm sure it's fine," she snapped, her patience, or the facade of it, finally cracking. "We have a limited supply, you know." "I'm sure you do," Marcus replied, his own patience now wearing thin. "But for the price of this ticket, I think a straight fork is a reasonable expectation." He wasn't trying to be difficult, But the accumulation of small indignities was starting to grate on him. He was a paying customer, and he was being treated like an intruder. A few other passengers began to notice the tension. The hushed cabin grew even quieter. Karen's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. She was having a bad month. Her mortgage was overdue, her son had just been suspended from school, and she felt the crushing weight of her age in a profession that prized youth. This young man in his casual clothes, sitting in a seat that cost more than her monthly salary, epitomized everything she felt was wrong with the world. He was an imposter, a symbol of unearned privilege, and he was challenging her authority in her cabin. "Listen to me," she hissed, leaning down, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "I don't know how you got this seat, but you will show me some respect. People like you need to learn your place." The phrase "people like you" struck Marcus like a physical blow. The quiet disapproval had now morphed into overt, ugly prejudice. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Grace is a weapon." He took a slow breath. "I think you are mistaken about who needs to learn their place," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "You are a service professional on a flight for which I am a customer. Your place is to do your job without being insulting. Now please, get me another fork." He had not raised his voice. He had not been rude. But his directness, his refusal to be cowed, was the final straw for Karen. The years of resentment, the personal failures, the professional anxieties, it all coalesced into a single, irrational point of rage. She drew her hand back. The motion seemed to happen in slow motion. The other passengers gasped. Crack. The sound of her hand connecting with his cheek was sharp and loud, a gunshot in a library. The slap was hard enough to snap his head to the side. A stunned silence descended upon the cabin. For a moment, the only sound was the drone of the Rolls-Royce engines. Indifferent, thousands of feet above the cold, dark ocean. Marcus slowly turned his head back, a red handprint already blooming on his brown skin. He didn't look angry. He didn't look hurt. He looked at her with an expression of profound disappointment and something else. Finality. Karen stared at her own hand, as if it had betrayed her. The shock of her own action washed over her, followed by a tidal wave of panic. What had she just done? Marcus calmly folded his napkin, placed it on his tray, and reached into his backpack. He pulled out his satellite phone. He didn't say another word to her. He simply looked past her, as if she had already ceased to exist, and pressed a single number on his speed dial. The silence in the first-class cabin was thick and heavy, like a wool blanket soaked in water. Every eye was on Marcus Vance, whose cheek now bore the distinct, angry red outline of a hand. Karen Peterson stood frozen, the blood draining from her face, her own hand tingling with the ghost of the impact. The slap had been a catastrophic miscalculation, a momentary loss of control with consequences she couldn't yet begin to fathom. Marcus ignored her completely. He held the satellite phone to his ear, waiting. The call connected almost instantly. "Dad," he said, his voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "Sorry to bother you. I'm on GWA Flight 117 to Heathrow." He paused, listening. The other passengers leaned in, shamelessly eavesdropping. This was better than any in-flight movie. "Everything's fine, I'm okay. But we have a situation here. An employee assaulted me." He listened again, his eyes scanning the cabin ceiling, his expression unreadable. "Yes, physically. A flight attendant." Karen's heart hammered against her ribs. Assaulted. The word was so clinical, so legal. It transformed her desperate, angry outburst into a crime. "No, I don't need you to do anything dramatic," Marcus continued, a faint, wry smile touching his lips for a fraction of a second. "But I'm not comfortable continuing this flight with this crew. I don't feel safe." He paused again. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm asking. I want this plane to turn around." A collective silent gasp went through the cabin. Turn the plane around? An international flight? Hours over the Atlantic? It was unthinkable. It was the kind of request that was reserved for a terrorist threat or a critical medical emergency. It would cost the airline hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of dollars in fuel, landing fees, passenger compensation, and logistical chaos. Karen stared at him. a flicker of disbelief warring with her mounting terror. He was just a kid in a hoodie, a bluffer. Who did he think he was? Who could he possibly be calling? Marcus listened for another 30 seconds. Okay, thank you, Dad. I'll see you in a bit. He ended the call, placed the phone on his tray table, and picked up his tablet, resuming his reading as if he had just arranged for a car to pick him up at the airport. Karen finally found her voice. You can't be serious, she stammered, trying to project an authority she no longer felt. You think you can just make one phone call and have this plane turned around? That's not how it works. We'll see, Marcus said, not even looking up from his screen. Her colleague, a younger flight attendant named Sarah, rushed over, her face pale. Karen, what happened? The captain is getting a message from corporate, a code red priority directive. Karen's blood ran cold. Code Red was a designation she had only heard of in training simulations. It was reserved for directives coming from the highest echelons of corporate leadership, the CEO, the board of directors. Less than 5 minutes later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. It was strained, tight with a confusion and frustration he was trying his best to conceal beneath a professional veneer. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I apologize for this unexpected announcement. Due to an unforeseen customer service issue that requires our immediate attention back in New York, we will be turning the aircraft around and returning to JFK. We understand this is a significant disruption to your travel plans, and we sincerely apologize. The cabin crew will be providing more information shortly. Please remain in your seats. The cabin erupted, not in outrage, but in a wave of stunned, incredulous murmurs. They all turned to stare at seat 2A. The kid in the hoodie hadn't been bluffing. He had made one phone call, and a Boeing 777 in the middle of its journey across the Atlantic was now making a 180-degree turn. The sheer, naked display of power was breathtaking. It was the kind of influence that didn't need to shout. It whispered, and the world changed course. Karen stumbled back into the galley, leaning against the counter for support. Her legs felt like jelly. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be happening. Who was he? Sarah followed her, her eyes wide. Karen, who is he? What did you do? I don't know, Karen whispered, her mind racing. The name on the passenger manifest was Vance M. It had meant nothing to her. She scrolled through 1,000 possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. A politician's son? A foreign prince traveling incognito? The flight back to New York was the longest 2 hours of Karen Peterson's life. The first-class cabin was eerily silent. The other passengers shot her looks that ranged from pity to contempt. Marcus never looked at her again. He simply sat there reading, a silent, powerful indictment of her actions. He had won. He hadn't just finished the fight, he had rewritten the rules of the entire engagement. As the plane began its descent back toward JFK, the fastened seatbelt sign pinged on. For the other passengers, it signaled the end of a bizarre and inconvenient journey. For Karen, it sounded like a death knell. When the plane finally docked at the gate, a remote gate, far from the main terminal, the jet bridge connected with a final, ominous thud. The captain made another announcement, his voice grim. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We ask that you keep the aisles clear. Airport officials will be boarding the aircraft momentarily. Karen watched in horror as 2 stern-faced Port Authority police officers and 3 people in sharp business suits, airline executives, she realized with a sickening lurch, walked down the aisle. They didn't look at any of the passengers. Their eyes were fixed on one person, her. One of the executives, a woman with iron gray hair and a severe expression, stopped beside her. Ms. Peterson, she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Global Wings Air. We need you to come with us. Please collect your personal belongings. Karen's mind short-circuited. Vance. She looked from the executive to the young man in seat 2A, who was now being personally and deferentially greeted by the COO. He had a last name, and apparently so did the COO. It was in that horrifying, gut-wrenching moment of clarity that Karen Peterson understood. She hadn't slapped some random kid. She hadn't assaulted a customer. She had assaulted a Vance. And the woman standing in front of her wasn't just any executive. The nameplate on her jacket read Eleanor Vance. She was David Vance's sister, Marcus Vance's aunt, and Karen had just committed career suicide in front of a member of the family that, as it turned out, owned a 15% controlling stake in the airline she worked for. The walk from the aircraft was a blur of fluorescent lights and sterile corridors. Flanked by the port authority officers and the grim-faced executives, Karen Peterson felt like a prisoner on death row. Her flight attendant's uniform, once a source of pride, now felt like a costume of shame. Every eye in the terminal seemed to be on her, whispers following in her wake. Her mind was a maelstrom of panic and denial. She was led to a sterile conference room in the airline's executive suite, a place she had only ever seen in corporate training videos. Eleanor Vance sat at the head of the long, polished table, her expression as unyielding as granite. A man from human resources and another from the airline's legal department sat beside her. "Karen Peterson," Eleanor began, her voice cutting through the silence. "You have been an employee of this airline for 25 years. In 1 hour, you have managed to cause more brand damage, financial loss, and safety protocol breaches than any employee in this company's history." The words were delivered without emotion, which made them hit even harder. This wasn't a scolding, it was a damage assessment. "The decision to ground Flight 117 was not made lightly," Eleanor continued. "It was made after my nephew, Marcus Vance, a passenger on your flight, reported a credible threat to his safety. That threat, Ms. Peterson, was you." "It was a misunderstanding," Karen choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "He was being difficult, disrespectful." The lawyer spoke for the first time. "We have preliminary statements from 3 other first-class passengers. They all state that Mr. Vance was polite and calm and that you were the aggressor. They also all corroborate that you used the phrase, 'people like you,' before striking him. Is that correct?" Karen's face paled. She had been so consumed by her own rage, she had forgotten about the audience. "And then you assaulted him," Eleanor stated flatly. "You put your hands on a passenger, not to restrain him, not in self-defense, but in an act of aggression. That alone is a fireable offense and a federal crime." I'm sorry," Karen stammered. "I don't know what came over me. My life, it's been very stressful lately." Eleanor Vance leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Do not for 1 second think that your personal problems are an excuse or a justification for an act of racist aggression on one of our aircraft. Do you have any idea who you just did this to?" Karen shook her head numbly. "Marcus Vance is the son of David Vance. David Vance is not just a beloved public figure, a pioneer in technology, and a philanthropist who has donated billions to education and social justice causes. He is also the head of the Vance Foundation, which holds the largest single block of shares in this airline's parent company. When my nephew called his father, he wasn't calling a parent to complain. He was calling our biggest and most important shareholder to report a catastrophic failure of service and safety." The full weight of her actions finally crushed Karen. It wasn't just a powerful family she had crossed. She had, in essence, assaulted her own boss's son, the ultimate boss. "Global Wings Air is terminating your employment, effective immediately," the HR man said, sliding a thick envelope across the table. "Your credentials are revoked. You will be escorted from the premises. Given the circumstances, we will not be offering a severance package. In fact, our legal team is currently evaluating the full financial damages to determine our next steps." "Next steps?" Karen echoed, bewildered. "The cost of diverting a 777 is approximately $200,000 in fuel, fees, and crew costs," the lawyer said coolly. "The cost of rebooking 247 passengers, providing them with hotel vouchers, and compensation as mandated by law will be another $300,000. The potential brand damage from a viral story about one of our senior flight attendants assaulting the son of a black billionaire. That's incalculable. We reserve the right to seek restitution." She was being fired, and now they were threatening to sue her for $500,000. Her world wasn't just collapsing, it was being pulverized into dust. Meanwhile, in a private lounge reserved for VIPs, Marcus was sitting with his father. David Vance had arrived at the airport in a sleek black electric sedan, just as the plane was landing. He wasn't a physically imposing man, but he radiated an aura of immense, quiet power. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his hair flecked with gray at the temples. his eyes sharp and perceptive. He listened intently as Marcus recounted the entire incident, his expression hardening with every word. "She said, 'People like you?'" David asked, his voice low and dangerous. Marcus nodded. "And then she slapped me." David Vance looked at the red mark on his son's cheek, which was now beginning to fade into a faint bruise. He reached out and gently touched the spot, his fingers tracing the outline of the insult. In that moment, he wasn't a billionaire titan of industry. He was just a father, looking at his injured child. "I am sorry this happened to you, son," David said. "No one should ever be treated that way." "I'm okay, Dad. It was just disappointing." "It's more than disappointing, Marcus. It's a disease, and it festers in places like that because of corporate complacency. Eleanor is handling the employee. That's the symptom. I'm more interested in the disease." David pulled out his own phone. He didn't call a lawyer or a publicist. He called the CEO of Global Wings Air's parent company, a man named Robert Miller, waking him up in the middle of the night in his Chicago mansion. "Robert, David Vance, we have a problem. A big one," he said. There were no pleasantries. "My son was racially profiled and then physically assaulted by one of your flight attendants on a flight this evening." "Yes, Flight 117. No, unacceptable doesn't begin to cover it, Robert. This isn't just about one employee. This is about a corporate culture that allows this kind of prejudice to exist. I want a full, independent audit of your company's hiring and training practices. I want to see the complaint history of every single flight attendant on your payroll. And I expect a public statement and a plan of action on my desk by Monday morning." The threat was implicit but crystal clear. Comply, or the Vance Foundation would begin divesting its shares, a move that would send the company's stock price into a nosedive and likely cost Robert Miller his job. David Vance hung up. He looked at his son. "This isn't about revenge, Marcus. Revenge is cheap. This is about responsibility. When you have this kind of power, you have a responsibility to use it to tear out the rot, not just trim the leaves." As Karen Peterson was escorted out of a side door of JFK Airport, stripped of her career and facing financial ruin, the real story was just beginning. The incident on Flight 117 was no longer about a slap. It was about to become a national conversation, and the Vance family was going to make sure that Global Wings Air and the world was listening. The story broke just before dawn. It didn't leak from the airline or the Vance family. It came from a passenger in business class, a tech blogger named Leo Kim, who had heard the commotion and seen the aftermath. His blog post titled, "I watched a flight attendant slap a man, and he turned the plane around with one call," went live at 5:15 a.m. By 7 a.m., it was the #1 trending topic on Twitter. The internet, as it is prone to do, erupted. Hashtags bloomed like toxic algae. Nush Flight 117, Yush slap heard round the world, and most virally, Global Wings Karen. Memes were created within minutes. Screenshots from Leo's blog post were everywhere. Speculation ran rampant. Who was the mysterious young man? Was the story even real? By 9 a.m., the mainstream media had caught on. Reporters were camped outside Global Wings Air headquarters and the Vance Innovations campus in Palo Alto. The story had all the elements of a modern media firestorm: race, class, power, and a dramatic confrontation at 35,000 feet. Global Wings Air was in full-blown crisis mode. Their PR department issued a terse, lawyer-approved statement. "We are aware of an incident that occurred on Flight 117, which necessitated a return to JFK. The safety and security of our passengers is our highest priority. A full investigation is underway. The employee in question has been suspended pending the outcome of this investigation." The word "suspended" was a strategic lie to temper the union's immediate reaction, but it did little to quell the public outcry. The statement was seen as weak, clinical, and insufficient. Karen Peterson, now at home in her small suburban apartment, watched her life being dissected and destroyed in real time. Her name hadn't been officially released, but online sleuths, using passenger-shot video snippets and flight crew forms, had identified her in a matter of hours. Her photo was plastered all over social media. Her address was leaked. She became the face of entitled, racist service workers everywhere. A GoFundMe was started for her, initially gaining some traction from people who believed she was a victim of an overprivileged nouveau riche bully. The narrative they spun was of a hardworking woman standing up to a disrespectful youth. The campaign was titled "Support a Working Woman Against Corporate Bullies." It raised nearly $10,000 in its first few hours. But the Vance family was silent. They issued no statement. Marcus gave no interviews. This strategic silence created a vacuum that the media and the public rushed to fill with their own narratives. But behind the scenes, David Vance was executing his plan with chilling precision. His team of investigators, former FBI agents and data analysts on the Vance Innovations payroll, were already digging. They weren't just looking into Karen Peterson, they were looking into Global Wings Air. As he had demanded, the airline reluctantly handed over years of internal documents, HR complaints, performance reviews, and settlement records. What they began to uncover was disturbing. Karen Peterson was not a model employee who had one bad day. The audit revealed a pattern. Over the past decade, 6 different complaints had been filed against her by passengers of color. They all told a similar story: rude behavior, passive-aggressive service, and thinly veiled contempt. 2 complaints explicitly mentioned her use of the phrase, "you people." In every single case, the airline's internal review had cleared her. The complaints were dismissed as customer misunderstandings or subjective interpretations. The union had protected her, and the airline, eager to avoid conflict and potential lawsuits, had swept it all under the rug. She was a liability they had chosen to ignore for years. Simultaneously, the media's narrative began to shift. A tenacious investigative journalist from ProPublica named Jessica Finch wasn't satisfied with the surface-level story. She started digging into the public comments on the GoFundMe page and noticed a pattern of support from a small, specific group of former Global Wings Air employees. She reached out to them. One of them, a recently fired flight attendant, finally agreed to talk, but only off the record. "Karen?" the woman said with a bitter laugh. "A victim? That's rich." Karen Peterson was the queen of the side hustle. She and a few of her senior friends had a system. They'd target passengers who looked like they wouldn't complain, usually young people, non-native English speakers, or people of color. They'd short them on duty-free change, accidentally overcharge for wine, and pocket the difference. It was small amounts, $20 or $30 a person, but on a long-haul flight, it added up. We all knew about it. Management looked the other way because her crew always had the highest in-flight sales numbers. This was the twist. This was the missing piece. Jessica Finch's investigation continued. She discovered that Karen was under significant financial pressure, not just from a mortgage, but from massive credit card debt and a series of bad investments. She wasn't just stressed, she was desperate. The day of Flight 117, Karen had received a final notice from her credit card company. The pressure was immense. She needed a good haul from the flight's sales. Marcus Vance, in her prejudiced view, wasn't just an unwelcome presence. He was a non-spender, a waste of a first-class seat that could have gone to a businessman who would buy a $300 bottle of scotch. His simple request for a straight fork wasn't just an annoyance. It was a challenge to her authority in the space she used to run her illicit side business. His calm demeanor infuriated her because it was a reminder of the power and security she so desperately lacked. The slap wasn't just an act of racism. It was the desperate, panicked lashing out of a cornered animal whose entire corrupt system was being threatened by a young man who refused to be intimidated. When Jessica Finch published her explosive article, "The Turbulent Past of Monash Global Wings Karen," the entire narrative collapsed. The GoFundMe page was shut down amidst a flood of angry comments demanding refunds. The story was no longer about a single moment of anger, but a long history of prejudice and petty crime, enabled by a corporation that consistently chose convenience over integrity. The hard karma was just beginning to hit. Losing her job was one thing. Becoming a national pariah was another. But the Vances weren't finished. The disease, as David Vance had called it, was still rooted deep within the airline, and he was preparing for the final phase of the treatment: excision. Jessica Finch's ProPublica article acted as an accelerant on an already raging fire. The revelation of Karen Peterson's long-running scam and the airline's complicity in ignoring her history of racist complaints turned the tide of public opinion completely. The narrative of the oppressed working woman evaporated, replaced by the image of a petty grifter whose prejudice was a tool of her trade. The airline, now facing a full-blown existential crisis, was forced to act. Robert Miller, the CEO of the parent company, knew he was on thin ice with David Vance, his most powerful shareholder. He greenlit a no-holds-barred internal affairs investigation, headed by the ruthless legal team Vance's people had recommended. They descended upon the flight operations department at JFK like wolves. The investigators quickly discovered that the side hustle was more organized than they could have imagined. It wasn't just Karen. It was a clique of about a dozen senior flight attendants and a couple of pursers. They called themselves the High Altitude Club. They used their seniority to bid for the most lucrative international routes, ensuring they always worked together. They had a system for swapping out credit card machines to bypass transaction logs and a method for manipulating inventory counts on liquor and luxury goods. Karen Peterson wasn't just a participant, she was one of the ringleaders. Her years of service and her intimidating demeanor had allowed her to run the scam with impunity, bullying younger crew members into silence. The complaints against her for racism had been a convenient cover. By dismissing those who complained as oversensitive or difficult, she and the airline had inadvertently protected her criminal enterprise. Anyone who might have noticed the financial discrepancies was afraid to speak up, lest they be branded a troublemaker, or worse, a racist themselves for targeting a veteran employee. The evidence was damning. Flight manifests cross-referenced with sales receipts showed glaring anomalies on every flight the High Altitude Club worked. Passenger statements, once solicited, poured in, detailing small but consistent instances of being overcharged or shortchanged. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. The airline had no choice but to clean house. One by one, the members of the club were brought in for interviews. Faced with irrefutable evidence in the threat of federal wire fraud charges, they turned on each other. The conspiracy unraveled in a cascade of accusations and confessions. In the end, 9 flight attendants, including Karen, and 2 pursers were fired. Global Wings Air was forced to hand the entire investigation over to the FBI. Karen Peterson's situation had gone from catastrophic to apocalyptic. She had lost her job, her reputation, and now she was the central figure in a federal criminal investigation. The GoFundMe money was gone, returned to the donors. Her savings were being drained by legal fees. The friends she had run the scam with now named her as the mastermind to get better deals for themselves. She was utterly and completely alone. The greatest twist, however, was yet to come, and it originated not from the FBI or the airline, but from the quiet, calculating mind of David Vance. He had watched the investigation unfold, satisfied with the house cleaning, but not with the root cause. Firing a few bad apples didn't change the tree. Robert Miller, the CEO, had called him to report the firings, expecting praise. He was met with a chilling silence. "You've addressed the symptoms, Robert, not the disease," David finally said. "Your corporate culture is what allowed this to fester for a decade. The union contracts that make it impossible to fire problematic employees, the HR department that prioritizes avoiding litigation over protecting passengers, the lack of any meaningful diversity and inclusion training. You're still sick, and I'm the physician." A week later, the financial world was stunned by a major announcement. The Vance Foundation, in partnership with 2 other activist investment firms, had executed a hostile takeover of Global Wings Air's parent company, Global Air Group. Through a series of aggressive stock purchases on the open market, they had secured a 51% controlling interest. David Vance was now, for all intents and purposes, the owner of the airline. The board was summarily dismissed. Robert Miller was fired, and the new CEO was announced, Eleanor Vance. The move was unprecedented. A tech billionaire had just seized control of a legacy airline, not for profit, but to force systemic change. In his first and only press conference on the matter, David Vance was unequivocal. "This is not a business venture," he told a throng of reporters. "This is a statement. The service industry, from airlines to restaurants, has for too long tolerated a culture of subtle and overt prejudice. My son's experience was a wake-up call. We are going to turn Global Wings Air into the gold standard for customer safety, respect, and inclusive service. We will rewrite the book on training. We will empower our employees to call out prejudice, and we will protect our passengers from it. Every single policy will be reviewed through a lens of equity and dignity. This airline will no longer sweep problems under the rug. We are going to rip out the floorboards and rebuild the entire foundation. For Karen Peterson, watching the press conference from her lawyer's office, this was the final crushing blow. Her slap had not just ended her career and her freedom, it had triggered a corporate earthquake. She had set out to put a young black man in his place, and in doing so, had inadvertently handed his family the keys to the entire kingdom. The irony was so profound it was almost poetic. She was no longer just a disgraced flight attendant. She was the catalyst, the footnote in the story of how the Vance family rewrote the rules of an entire industry. Her small act of hate had resulted in a revolution she could never have conceived. The wheels of justice, both legal and karmic, grind slowly, but for Karen Peterson, they were grinding exceedingly fine. The federal investigation concluded with a multi-count indictment against her and the other members of the High Altitude Club. The charges included wire fraud, conspiracy, and theft. Faced with a mountain of evidence and abandoned by her former colleagues, her lawyer advised her to take a plea deal. She stood before a judge in a drab federal courthouse, a shadow of the proud, uniformed woman who had patrolled the aisles of Flight 117. She was sentenced to 18 months in a low-security federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to the airline to the tune of $150,000, her estimated share of the scam's proceeds over the years. But the hard karma went far beyond a prison sentence. The legal system was punishing her for the fraud. Society, however, was punishing her for the slap. Her name became a permanent synonym for racial prejudice in the service industry. For the rest of her life, a simple Google search would link her to the incident, making future employment a near impossibility. She had become a ghost, haunted by a single, irrevocable moment of her own creation. Her family distanced themselves from her, ashamed of the public spectacle. The son she had been so worried about refused to visit her, his own school life made miserable by his mother's infamy. She had lost everything: her career, her freedom, her reputation, and her family. Meanwhile, the transformation of Global Wings Air under Vance's leadership was swift and radical. Eleanor Vance, armed with her brother's vision and a seemingly limitless budget, began the foundation rebuild he had promised. First, they settled with every passenger from the diverted Flight 117. They didn't just refund the tickets. They gave each passenger 100,000 frequent flyer miles and a personal written apology from David Vance himself, explaining the changes the airline was undergoing. The move turned a PR disaster into a masterclass in corporate accountability. Next, they completely overhauled the human resources department. The old guard was fired. A new chief people officer, a renowned expert in diversity, equity, and inclusion, was brought in. They implemented a zero-tolerance policy for any form of discrimination, backed by a new anonymous reporting system that protected whistleblowers. Training was revolutionized. Every single one of the airline's 20,000 employees, from baggage handlers to the CEO, was required to attend a series of intensive, mandatory workshops on unconscious bias, cultural competency, and de-escalation techniques. The new training modules were designed in partnership with leading social justice organizations and were famously rigorous. Some veteran employees quit, unable or unwilling to adapt. They were promptly replaced. The union contracts were renegotiated. The Vances played hardball, using the threat of bankruptcy and restructuring to break the clauses that protected problematic employees. Seniority was no longer the sole factor in route assignments. Performance reviews, which now included mandatory passenger feedback scores on courtesy and fairness, were given equal weight. The public face of the airline changed too. Advertising campaigns shifted to emphasize a message of universal welcome and respect. The tagline became Global Wings Air, where everyone belongs. But the most significant change was felt by Marcus Vance himself. The incident had changed him. The quiet, unassuming student had been thrust into the spotlight. He had seen firsthand how quickly prejudice could turn to aggression, and he had witnessed the immense power his family wielded. He realized that ignoring that power was a form of abdication. He approached his father with an idea. It wasn't enough to fix one airline. The disease was everywhere. Together, they launched a new branch of the Vance Foundation, the Dignity and Service Initiative. Its mission was to provide grants and free training resources to companies in the travel and hospitality sectors, airlines, hotel chains, cruise lines, committed to implementing meaningful anti-discrimination and sensitivity training. Their first partner and case study was, of course, Global Wings Air. Marcus became the public face of the initiative. He found his voice speaking at industry conferences and to media outlets not about the slap itself, but about what came after. He spoke about turning a moment of personal degradation into a catalyst for systemic change. He was no longer just a billionaire's son. He was a credible, eloquent advocate for a cause born from his own experience. The karma for Karen Peterson was the totality of her loss. The karma for the world was the totality of the gain. Her act of petty cruelty, intended to diminish one person, had inadvertently sparked a movement that would elevate and protect millions. The plane she grounded with her rage had, in a way, launched 1,000 new flights toward a better, more respectful future. The final, brutal irony was that the name Vance, which she had never bothered to learn, would now be synonymous with the very principles of decency and respect she had so spectacularly violated. 2 years felt like both a lifetime in the blink of an eye. For the world at large, the saga of Flight 117 had faded into the vast archives of internet lore, a memorable but distant drama. For those at its epicenter, however, the tremors of that day continued to shape their new reality. Karen Peterson's new reality smelled of cardboard and industrial cleaning fluid. After serving 14 months in a federal correctional facility in West Virginia, she was released into a world that had branded her with an invisible, indelible mark. Her name was now a verb, a meme, a cautionary tale whispered in corporate training rooms. She moved to a small, forgotten city in the Midwest, dyed her hair a mousy brown, and began using her mother's maiden name. Her life became a study in anonymity. Her days were spent at a sprawling distribution warehouse, working the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. Her job was to unpack boxes of imported home goods and stock them onto towering metal shelves in the cavernous, silent building. The work was physically demanding and mentally numbing, a stark contrast to the curated elegance of a first-class cabin. She rarely spoke to her coworkers, a collection of equally weary souls. She ate her lunch alone in her car, the windows fogged against the cold. The fury that had once fueled her was gone, burned out and replaced by a constant, low-grade fear, the fear of being recognized. One evening, a younger forklift driver paused beside her aisle. "Hey, you know who you look like?" he asked, squinting. "That crazy flight attendant lady from a couple years ago, the one who slapped that rich kid." Karen's heart seized. She felt the blood drain from her face. She forced a weak, thin laugh. "I get that sometimes," she mumbled, turning away to busy herself with a box of ceramic mugs. "Guess I just have one of those faces." The driver shrugged and drove off, but the encounter left her trembling for the rest of her shift. She was a ghost, haunted by the woman she used to be. In her bleakest moments, alone in her small, bare apartment, she would sometimes wonder what she felt more acutely: remorse for her actions or a bitter, corrosive self-pity for her own downfall. The truth, she knew, was a toxic mixture of both. She had ruined her life not for a grand principle, but for a moment of ugly, pointless rage. The knowledge was a heavier sentence than any judge could have imposed. In stark contrast, the entity she had so damaged was thriving beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Global Wings Air, now colloquially known as Vance Air by industry insiders, had become the gold standard. The transformation was visible everywhere. The old stuffy uniforms were replaced with modern, elegant designs by a high-end fashion house. The interiors of the planes were retrofitted with state-of-the-art entertainment systems and more comfortable seating in all classes. But the most profound change was the culture. Eleanor Vance had instituted the Uplift program. Every employee, from the ticket counter to the cockpit, was empowered to fix customer problems on the spot with a discretionary budget. No questions asked. A lost bag didn't just get an apology, it got the passenger an immediate compensation voucher and a taxi credit. A delayed flight meant free meals and streaming service subscriptions for everyone on board. The new flight attendants, recruited from the top ranks of the hospitality industry, were multilingual, emotionally intelligent, and rigorously trained in de-escalation. A young flight attendant named Maya, who had joined 6 months ago, perfectly embodied this new ethos. On a flight from LA to Tokyo, a nervous mother traveling with a crying infant was receiving glares from a few other passengers. The old GWA response would have been to either ignore it or politely ask the mother to quiet her child. Maya, however, knelt by the mother's seat. She learned the baby was teething. She returned a moment later not just with a chilled teething ring from the galley's medical kit, but with a pair of high-end noise-canceling headphones for the disgruntled passenger in the next row, offered with a smile and a quiet, "We wanted to make sure your journey is as peaceful as possible." The mother was relieved, the other passenger was placated, and a potential conflict was transformed into a moment of exceptional service. This was the GWA standard, and it was winning them legions of loyal customers. This standard was the direct result of Marcus Vance's tireless work. The Dignity in Service initiative had become his life's calling. He had deferred his graduate school plans, pouring all his energy into the foundation. He was no longer the quiet kid in the hoodie. He had become a compelling and respected leader. He developed a unique, immersive training program that used virtual reality to put executives and service employees in the shoes of marginalized customers. He would stand before skeptical boards of directors and walk them through data that proved a culture of respect wasn't just good ethics. It was brilliant business, leading to higher employee retention and customer loyalty. The incident had forged him. He still carried the memory of the slap, not as a wound, but as a compass. It oriented him, constantly reminding him of the stakes. In a quiet moment in his Palo Alto office, looking over a proposal for a partnership with a major hotel chain, his father David walked in. "Long day?" David asked. "Long week," Marcus replied with a tired smile. "Just trying to convince a 70-year-old CEO that the customer is always right is less important than the customer is always human." David looked at his son, a deep sense of pride in his eyes. "You know," he said softly, "for a long time after that flight, I felt a kind of rage I hadn't felt in years. All I wanted was to burn it all down, punish that woman, ruin that airline." "Why didn't you?" Marcus asked. "Because you didn't," David replied. "In the middle of it all, you were the calmest one. You wanted accountability, not just revenge. You taught me that the greatest power isn't the ability to destroy. It's the ability to rebuild something better from the wreckage. This," he said, gesturing around the office, "this is all your vision." That vision found its clearest voice in a community college auditorium in a working-class neighborhood of Detroit. Marcus was the keynote speaker, launching a scholarship program the initiative was funding for students pursuing careers in hospitality. He stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of young, hopeful, diverse faces. "2 years ago," he began, his voice calm and resonant, "I was on a flight to London. I was a customer, but I was made to feel like an intruder. An employee of a massive multi-billion-dollar corporation decided, based on the color of my skin and the clothes I was wearing, that I didn't belong, that she had the right to humiliate me and then to assault me." The room was utterly silent. What she failed to understand, and what so many systems fail to understand, is that dignity is not a perk of a first-class ticket. It's not something that is given or taken away. It is inherent. My father's phone call didn't restore my worth. It simply held a mirror up to a corporation that had forgotten its own. That call was not about the vengeance of a billionaire. It was a demand for accountability. It was a declaration that the comfort of a few can never be built on the degradation of anyone. He paused, letting the words sink in. The real power was not in the dramatic act of grounding a plane. That's a headline. The real power is in the quiet, difficult, day-to-day work that comes after. It's in rewriting training manuals. It's in creating reporting systems that protect the vulnerable. It's in hiring people who see service not as a subservient task, but as a noble act of human connection. "You," he said, his voice rising with passion as he pointed to the students, "are the next generation of leaders in that work. You have the power to make every single person you meet, the tired traveler, the nervous family, the demanding executive, feel seen, respected, and safe. That is a greater power than any billionaire possesses. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." As he finished, the auditorium erupted in a wave of thunderous, standing applause. It was here in this room full of future possibilities that the story of Flight 117 found its true conclusion. It was no longer a story about a slap, a plane, or a single act of karmic justice. It was about the infinite ripples that spread from a moment of conflict. The story ended not with the hard, closed fist of retribution, but with the open, helping hand of progress. A hand that Marcus Vance, forged by an ugly moment in the sky, now extended to the world. And that's where our story ends. It's a stark reminder that our actions, no matter how small we think they are, can have consequences that ripple out in ways we can never predict. For Karen Peterson, a moment of prejudice born from personal misery didn't just cost her a job. It set in motion a chain of events that exposed a rotten system and ultimately led to its revolutionary transformation. It's a story of karmic justice, but it's also a story of responsibility, showing how those with immense power can and should use it not for petty revenge, but to enforce lasting, positive change for everyone. What do you think? Was David Vance's complete takeover of the airline the right move, or an extreme abuse of power? Was Karen's fate a justified outcome for her actions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of karmic justice and unexpected consequences resonated with you, please help us by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and most importantly, subscribing to our channel for more true life dramas. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for listening.